Hello. It is with great appreciation to the ISG for its recognition of my work, and in particular for Crisis of Genocide, that I am with you today, albeit, as you can see, in a somewhat virtual capacity. Sincere thank yous aside, the Lemkin Award offers an unusual opportunity to talk to you about my work on genocide, though I fear this comes with an advance health warning. What I have to say is not always palatable or easily digestible, runs against many conventional wisdoms, and to add insult to injury will also strike a rather discordant note among an audience primarily made up of legal or would-be legal advocates. From my opening comments, you'll very quickly glean that the debt to Lemkin aside, discourses about international law or even human rights are not the driving force in my more than quarter of a century of work on this subject. So, to try and assist you on what the hell I'm doing here, I'm going to offer some brief signposting before I move on to the meat of this discussion. This will attempt to run with a theme implicit within the crisis of genocide, but which I want to propose has not only resonances with, but direct relevance to, our present human condition, that is, in the context of our present and ongoing crisis relationship with the planetary biosphere. The crisis of genocide has been part of an ongoing project of historical synthesis, the aim of which is to understand genocide as an aspect of modern world historical development. Or to put it more precisely, in 4 volumes to date, I have sought to plot the sequence, the staging of genocide within a trajectory towards a global political economy composed of nation states within an international system of such states. You will immediately see from this statement that the landscape I have been attempting to encompass cannot be isolated to particular states or societies outside of or at the margins of a supposedly normative mainstream. Nor can it simply be reduced to the actions of what I might call mad, sad or bad people whose aberrant behaviour is simply willfully at odds with the tenets of the Genocide Convention. At issue here is not simply a matter of countries such as Britain, America, France or Australia having committed genocide in the not-so-distant past. It is rather of trying to understand the totality of political, economic, psychosocial and cultural interactions which both synchronously and diachronically have made our world with genocide as one key byproduct of it. To put the matter bluntly, the phenomenon is not aberrant but systemic, a signature not just of a Saddam, a Stalin, a Pol Pot or a Hitler, but of intensely problematic interstate and societal relationships which have emerged over time in the drive towards a hegemonic, yet extremely dysfunctional world system. However, if one starts from this unconventional premise, the notion of a genocidal signature can have a rather useful role. It can tell us as much about the nature of a general historical development as history might teach us lessons about genocide. Indeed, I've almost arrived at a point where the term genocide seems to me not so much an expression of a type of violence, so much as a set of historical conjunctures. Let's take, for instance, the intense genocidal sequence of the Crisis books. From 1912 to 1953, there was a repeated incidence of genocide in an extensive, but certainly in global terms, limited geographical arena, which I have called the European Rimlands. We might treat this as simply stochastic, the bad luck of a Stalinist or Hitlerian totalitarian turn. Alternatively, we could see it as evidence of a deeper crisis in the struggles for a single globalised system in which its metropolitan, liberal, avant-garde purveyors, as founded on the building blocks of the nation-state, impacted upon a European semi-periphery of imperial states, not just at the latter's precise, exposed rim, but at a prolonged moment of total war-triggered shattering, and in which, crucially, the peoples of that rim bore the full genocidal brunt. Now, if this is admittedly a very telescope rendering of a thesis, hopefully it's just sufficient to set the scene for what I actually want to talk about today. The 1948 Genocide Convention speaks of groups of people, ethnic, racial, religious and national, as if the world were already somehow demarcated and ordered into such single or perhaps singular entities. Lemkin, certainly in the way that he followed Gottfried Herder, seems to have held that communal groups did have intrinsic cultural attributes which might even be defined in terms of some primordial genos. Yet this is rather strange when we think in terms of where Lemkin himself grew up, in a wonderfully mixed corner of Bialystok province of the Russian Empire. Here, ordinary people did not think of themselves historically in terms of nation. Rather, identity was a matter of family, of kin, of community, of place, though to be sure always one of religious group belonging. And this was true for the whole Rimlands, a huge swathe of territory embracing the Balkans, Anatolia, the Caucasus, and what used to be called the lands between, including of course Bialystok, which on the one hand was vastly, beautifully, ethnographically diverse and complex, and on the other, because of the very nature of traditional economic and social relations, decidedly local, and in which relationships across cultural divides were between neighbours and communities, not nations. There were of course boundaries, both cultural and political, which could not be transgressed. Yet there were also usually porosity in terms of the possibility of seasonal or even migratory movement across nominal, sometimes quite fuzzy state boundaries in this longue durée of time-honoured existence. The categorization of these complex and usually highly polyglot societies into national entities from the beginning of the 19th century came from the outside, through Western ideas, as these were intruded through usually highly urban, educated, elite intermediaries. Paradoxically, people like Lemkin himself. But the question you are probably asking and thinking is, why should this matter to us as genocide scholars? In the first instance, I think it does so because it tells us something very critical about what's absent in the Genocide Convention, which foregrounds very modern categorizations of people into this or that supposed aggregate, but says nothing about the actual lived environment, the habitat in which their localized difference made sense. Up to a point, the 1919 Allied-sponsored Minorities Treaties implicitly attempted to acknowledge the existence of this difference as grounded in cultural or religious attributes which might put some groups at a disadvantage against some supposed dominant norm. One should add that while a human geography of such difference was implicit in the treaties, they distinctly avoided the problem of any spatial grounding to that difference. Nevertheless, these actually very flimsy treaties are important to us because they are the backdrop against which Lemkin tried to devise a formula for protecting the vulnerability of such groups against the state. His starting point thus was the new national condition of the new Europe, in which people and peoples become defined as either members of a majority or minority group, with the issue becoming all the more urgent for Lemkin when even that distinction was suffocated with the post-1945 dumping of the Minorities Treaties. Long before that, however, what's already crystal clear about New Europe nation building is the way that it was premised on an internationally sanctioned state control of territorial space, which suffocated the possibility of localized habitat and hence habitus. The choice, in other words, for those who did not fit the new homogenizing prescript was either a metabolic transformation into a tissue indistinguishable from that of the supposed majority archetype, or a literal vomiting out from the limits of this now normative order. So what as a result actually happens between 1912 and 1953 to whole swathes of people who do not fit the prescript? Over and over again, we can see two things at work. The first, a process whereby marginalised communities find that their ability to live within their historic social and cultural environment is no longer tenable. The consequences being that they become more hemmed in and more cut off from the possibility of a simple livelihood. At its most extreme, this could mean that they might literally not be able to provide for themselves, that food is even taken away from them, and they are physically prevented, most probably on pain of death, from leaving their given area to find it. We might think of the Nazi Jewish ghettos of Poland as one extreme example, or there again, the Nazi Nisko project in 1939-40 to create a crowded reservation for Jews, Gypsies and other ethnic Untermenschen at the eastern extremity of the then Hitlerian Empire. Equally, we might think of the Holodomor in Stalin's Ukraine from less than a decade earlier, where people starved to death in their millions because they are literally kettled in within their communities to the point where their environmental base becomes trashed beyond recognition. In fact, these prominent examples are simply the most suggestive of cases which repeat time and time again in our Rimlands paroxysm, as different states attempt to implement their often consciously lethal population policies. Then there's the other side to this spatial rupture, where folk are forced to either flee for their lives from their habitat, or are actually compulsorily removed from it forever, leaving behind everything which gave them both economic livelihood and with it a sense of belonging and hence meaning. The list of such movements is so staggering it would take far too long to here enumerate, and the numbers involved are of course in their millions. Jews, Armenians, Greeks, Ottoman Muslims and ethnic Germans are the most well known of the compulsorily deported in what otherwise are clearly cases of genocidal ethnic cleansing. But what is more alarming, surely from a Western perspective, is that the notion of such transfers or population exchanges had already been internationally sanctioned as a key feature of the 1923 Lausanne Treaty between Turkey and the Western Allies, effectively overturning the protection offered in the Minorities Treaties, and a quarter of a century before those treaties were officially consigned to the dustbin of history. Lausanne, by contrast, becomes practically a blueprint for what is internationally allowable. When the 1937 Peel Report proposed the British partition of Palestine, it specifically cited Lausanne as a successful, supposedly peaceful way of compulsorily disentangling national populations. When Hitler oversaw the first stages of the territorial rearrangement of the new Europe in 1938 and 1939, with the imprimatur to major new population exchanges of Bulgarians, Romanians and Hungarians, he was simply recasting the Lausanne model in his own hegemonic interest. The next year's Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact vastly extended the scope of such force movements in both eastern and western directions. Yet the apotheosis of this process, at least in terms of numbers, was mandated at Yalta by the Allies, Churchill and Roosevelt alongside Stalin. At least in this arrangement, one might say that the 12 million Germans and many hundreds of thousands of evicted Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians and others had somewhere to which they notionally might go, though leaving behind hundreds of thousands who perished violently, genocidally, in the process. By contrast, in the case of the long sequence of Soviet internal deportations, or projected deportations from 1930 to 1953 to the far back and beyond, the communal death tolls were entirely more catastrophic for a whole caste of officially or unofficially punished nations. Though, of course, one might wish to add that the back and beyond also happened to be someone else's habitat, whether for Uzbeks, Kyrgyz, or Siberian indigenous peoples, or simply those who had been deported prior and who somehow now had to make room for a new set of emaciated and traumatized arrivals. But what I think is most alarming in retrospect, looking back at all this, is how the idea of removing unwanted peoples to somewhere else, somewhere out of the way, was not peculiar to a Stalin or Hitler. The notion of Madagascar, or for that matter, the furthest reaches of the Russian Far East, as a place to which European Jewish refugees might be removed to, was entertained by senior British government spokesmen, as it was by Nazi genocidaires, and many governments beside. And for that matter, Roosevelt, too, also had another wartime M project, not Manhattan, but migration, whose exact remit was to consider any number of obscure, supposedly uninhabited or sparsely inhabited places at the far ends of the planet where extraneous, by implication unwanted population groups, could be removed en masse and then, supposedly, resettled. Three things, then, I find particularly striking about these removal agendas and projections. Firstly, ordinary people are aggregated on grounds of what they've been designated as by other people. In other words, state elite policymakers and opinion formers, not in terms of their own sense of communal self. Secondly, the notion of group removal had become so standard and normal by 1948 that the possibility that it might actually be causal to genocide hardly even figured in the discussion leading to the convention. Thirdly, at the very same time when the UN was getting very lofty about individual rights, communal relationships to habitat and hence livelihood were deemed completely irrelevant. Why? Because such communal entities had no place within a universalized modernity where sole sovereignty lay with the nation state, as in turn founded on a developmental imperative which rendered meaningless any concept of communal space, for which read writ large the global commons, leaving thus the only dubious protection available to vulnerable communities to be designated as part of some supposed ethnic, religious, or other aggregate of victims. Which paradoxically means that Lemkin's law, in its very modern insistence on group categorization, reinforces the model of universalized nation statehood, even while it so clearly puts the finger on the potential consequences of being stateless and hence defenseless. Now, here's the question to which this has all been leading. Why should this matter now? and my answer in part relates to how people as aggregated into named groups is again metamorphosing, but in such a way that if we are not careful, it will lead the Genocide Convention as nothing more than a latter-day dinosaur. It shouldn't take too much for most of us to recognise that there is an ongoing but permanent emergency which involves both vast movements of people, yet in its antithesis is equally bottling up vast numbers of people both in urban and rural areas, and hence threatening their present and their futures. I began scoping this lecture before the latest dramatic surge of displaced, traumatised people from the Middle East and beyond, attempting to cross the Mediterranean to ostensibly safe European shores, took on a quite explosive dimension. Yet even this mass flight is only the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the ephemeral news headlines, the underlying macro story is one of environmental degradation, itself underpinned by the accelerating consequences of anthropogenic climate change. As I began writing this piece, a UK government-sponsored task force report had just predicted huge food production shocks as a result of increasingly regular extreme weather by the end of the century. But for earth scientists, this is hardly news. The world-renowned Hadley Centre for the Study of Climate Change estimates that 1/3 of the Earth's land surface will be desert by 2100, and up to half suffering drought. The Pentagon, recognising these possibilities back in 2004, commissioned its own report, in which it imagined an abrupt climate event, including a collapse of the Gulf Stream, triggering a major exodus of climate refugees from, among other places, Europe. Meanwhile, the role of the US national state security apparatus in this scenario would be preventing such refugees from getting in to Fortress America. Defence contractors have not been idle these last few years, working on a range of multi-billion-dollar programs geared towards supposedly sub-lethal interdiction of such mass population flows. Where those fail, however, there are always more obvious barriers. The Hungarian razor wire fence just being constructed, the Israeli Green Line with all its high-tech lethality, but also the 2,000-mile-long steel one, replete with landmines being built along the entirety of the Indian-Bangladeshi border. Hemming rural people in on ever more limited and marginalised land is another story, but all one has to do is look at the manner in which vast areas of sub-Saharan Africa are today being bundled up into tracts for the production of food and biofuels for business cartels operating from China, South Korea, as well as the West, to see how the denial of basic sustenance for people existence, in short, starvation, does not come through simply drought or flood. It comes through basic yet increasing discrepancies in human power relations. Are there genocidal implications here? My answer has to be absolutely yes, and for reasons I have already tried to imply from my earlier historical exposition. True, protecting the contemporary national interest in an environmentally beleaguered world may be little different from the ancient practice of keeping the barbarian at the gate. In 2008, the US think tank, the Center for New American Security, played a war game involving leading international players from the major industrialized blocs, in which, in an emergency climate change scenario, they perceived the major threat as being swamped by masses of environmental refugees. The war game response was to draw up a treaty for the supposedly non-coercive repatriation of these refugees. But how exactly are states to achieve such repatriation non-coercively? Perhaps the panel of ex-NATO generals were a whole lot more honest a few months earlier when they made a public press briefing urging that the alliance should maintain its ongoing commitment to a nuclear first strike, citing amongst climate and energy challenges the threat of mass environmental migration. What I think is interesting about these harbingers of what we might call the new normal is that the people's threat to the integrity of the nation state is no longer being treated as it was 50 years ago, as something mostly to do with the supposed national, ethnic or religious characteristics of group aggregates. There are, of course, many instances where that still applies, where if you are Yazidi, Rohingya, Chechen or Uyghur, genocidal vulnerability is built into your very condition. But increasingly, a simple designation of someone as a refugee, migrant, or even asylum seeker is now enough to raise the nation-state alarm bells. In short, what am I saying? As I have tried to suggest, Lemkin's proposition was founded on a particular way of seeing communal aggregates, which has been absolutely borne out in the way that states themselves see them through the projective prism of their own anxious or belligerent national self-conception. Yet in a world on the environmental brink, the threat of people extermination as founded on an ethnic or such similar designation cannot be treated any more as canonical. To be sure, the struggles for the last vestiges of the global commons, in which fourth world peoples and subsistence farmers are on the front line, may be embraceable in traditional genocide convention terms, because some of these people have group names. But then their perceived threat to the state, or beyond that multinational interests, is as likely to arise from the fact that they are where they are, not who they are, the state response of which will be to kettle and bottle them up even further, to the point where what is deliberately inflicted upon them are conditions calculated to bring about their physical destruction. But what of the others? The vast swathes of humanity, ourselves potentially included, who faced with becoming environmental refugees or migrants may instill the lethal wrath of states simply on that account. Lemkin's law, if it ever could, can no longer be contained within its historic terms of victim reference. Genocide scholars often argue that their disciplinary interest comes out of something more than the academic, but is founded on a commitment to the well-being of peoples and whose corollary is a desire for a better world. But to arrive there, we may be needing very urgently to reconsider some conventional wisdoms by which we assume our understanding of what we call genocide, the underlying roots of how we arrived here, and also what is changing in the process. The nation-state has been the fundamental and purposeful building block in the modern world's accelerated, universalized drive towards a globalized political economy. But in that same drive, we now should be able also to discern the first causes of a planetary disruption on a scale of which we have never as a species previously encountered. There is an ancient Greek term, oikoumene, which means the inhabited known world of human beings. Underlying Lemkin's search for terms of protection for all the world's human inhabitants, there was surely always empathy, compassion, a commitment to difference, and over and beyond that, a recognition of the need to deepen our humanity. We will need those elements all the more as the conditions for what we have until now called genocide transmute and metamorphose into an entirely more all-encompassing anthropogenic, indeed anthropocenic twilight. Thank you.